Okay, so let's begin the session. So yes, how was your new year? How is it going? Have you taken any special new year? Hello, am I audible? Okay. Any special new year resolutions based on your postponed NEET exam? Have you taken any new resolutions like that? Okay, so okay, we'll try our best. Very good. So yeah, anyway, it's like, you have got another few more months before your examination. So let us not say it in months, let us say it in some days. Okay, so you have to work out well. This is very crucial period. Okay, so what you should never forget to do practicing the question answering sessions. Okay, so you have to try to answer as much as questions as possible. Theory reading is not the thing when it comes to a MCQ based entrance examination. It is always like, how we go about answering a particular question. So the approach of answering questions is what is the key to success when it comes to entrance examinations, especially NEET, because the questions that they frame will be it's not like some other examinations. It is really different. So you have to apply. You should have the practice of doing such questions when it comes to NEET examination. So today's session is a revision of biochemistry. Did you all go through the videos? I hope that was useful. Did you go through the videos? Were the videos useful? I need some reply or response. Did you all go through it or not? Did you receive the videos? Did you all receive the videos? Please respond. Okay, you got the videos, right? So was it useful? Did you go through the videos? Were you able to follow? Because see, biochemistry is a little tough. Because it's all based on those different pathways and cycles. So remembering that pathway and and going through all those enzymes or each step enzyme, what are all the products, that is little quite challenging for you to remember. So in the videos I have tried to include a few tips by which you can, or some mnemonics by which you can which will help you to remember those enzymes involved or the steps or the byproducts and all those things, and some key points. See, whatever that, if you can remember the picture of the pathway that I have given in the video as well as in the synopsis, if you can just try to remember that, then it's more than enough, because beyond that questions will not come. You just should understand the concept of how the pathway runs around, which is the starting compound, important byproducts, and the enzymes involved, which is a rate limiting step, and such things. Okay, so that is the key to success when it comes to biochemistry. Okay, just a minute. Okay, so now today I have tried to include a few questions. Altogether 35 questions is what we are going to discuss today. So each question I have just put a particular important question from a particular cycle so that we can just have a brief outline or discussion about the cycle. Okay. So vitamins in this section I have not included at all. Vitamins is very, very important. Okay. So usually why I didn't include is the table, discussing the table is quite boring. Okay. Vitamin, most of the things, mostly they will ask what is the deficiency manifestation or a few important terminologies associated with each vitamin and all those things. Okay. So it's better that you all go through the table. Okay. And I hope that vitamin video, you might receive it in when it comes to oral medicine and radiology. In that section, in the oral medicine part, I have discussed vitamins. So you can, you will receive those videos from that. So when for biochemistry examinations, you please go through the table given in the biochemistry synopsis for you to answer. Okay. A little more in detail, that vitamin section will be dealt in medicine topics. When it comes to medicine revision, at that time, that video you will get it. Okay. So now I'm moving on to first section is proteins and their metabolism. So which are the basic structural units that comprises of the proteins? Which is the basic structural unit of a protein? See, I want all of you to participate because this is a revision and not a theory lecture. Okay, revision means it's not like just me talking and answering the few questions. No, I want all of you to answer the question. Try answering, try attempting the questions. Okay, very simple questions, because biochemistry mostly very, very simple superficial question comes. In depth, they don't usually go because that is not needed. Very few questions have come from biochemistry, but still you should go with biochemistry. It is not a subject that you have to avoid. Okay, so you have to go through at its basic synopsis and the questions. Please try to answer. It's more than enough for you to get through the questions. Yes, very good. The basic structural unit of protein is amino acid. So from the name, amino acid means they have an amino group and a carboxylic group, that is an acid group, right? So they will have another one is the hydrogen atom and a side chain given as R. So based on the alterations in the side chain, they can be acidic, basic, or sulfur containing amino acid, like then aliphatic amino acids, so branch chain amino acids. All those is based on the structural classification of amino acids is based on the side chain R. Okay, which is the simplest amino acid? Which is the simplest amino acid? Glycine. Very good. Why is it called simplest amino acid? So what is the side chain R? See, each amino acid differs in their structure based on the differences in the side chain. So what is the side chain in glycine? No, it has a side chain. Who said no side chain? It has a side chain. But what is the compound? Yes, it is H only. It is again a hydrogen atom. Okay, so that is why it does not make a big difference, because here also it's a nitrogen atom and here also that is another hydrogen atom. So because of that, does not make a big difference in its structure, right? And that is why glycine, see, amino acids, due to the property of different side chain R, they exhibit optical isomerism. So since in glycine, since that side chain R is again in hydrogen atom, it does not show optical isomerism, or it is considered to be optically inactive. Okay. So glycine, the simplest amino acid, is present in, what is the answer? A, hemoglobin, B, glutathione, C, purines, and D, all of the above. So glycine, see, amino acids, actually each and every amino acid may be again, involved in the structural or in the formation of other amino acids also. Okay, so glycine is involved in, yes, it is involved in, or it is present as a compound in hemoglobin, glutathione, and also purines. Okay, it acts as a precursor in the synthesis of all of these compounds. Okay, it is involved in the synthesis of purine, heme or hemoglobin, then glutathione, serine, and creatine. Fine. Serotonin is derived from, yes, serotonin is derived from tryptophan metabolism. So what all you know about tryptophan? Tryptophan is a very important amino acid. So what all you know? A few important points that you should know with yes, niacin, yes, it is important cofactor for the various cofactors like NAD, NAD plus and all is like it's important for the formation of such cofactors, very good. Precursor of serotonin and melatonin, very good. It is the first identified essential amino acid. So what is meant by essential amino acid? What diet? Not diet actually, but see, amino acids, we get all amino acids from our diet. Each and every amino acid. Yes, essential means our body cannot produce such amino acids by itself. So we need to acquire it through diet. Whereas the rest of like essential amino acids are like, remember that mnemonics AV Hill MPTT. So apart from that, rest all amino acids we have to acquire, our body can synthesize them. And hence they are non-essential. That means even in our diet, if they are deficient also, that is fine because our body can make them. Whereas this essential amino acids means they are like, they act as a precursor for the synthesis of various other amino acids or compounds in our body. And our body as such cannot synthesize such amino acids de novo. So that is the term why they are called essential amino acid, because it is essential for our body. Okay. So it's a precursor for serotonin and melatonin formation. These are a few points that you should remember with when it comes to tryptophan. Okay. Which of the following is an essential amino acid? Yeah, sorry, I forgot to put this thing for this thing AV Hill MPTT. Fine. So the answer here is all of the above. Yes, I forgot to put this animation for it. So actually, it is AV Hill MPTT stands for arginine, valine, histidine, isoleucine, leucine, lysine, methionine, phenylalanine, threonine, and tryptophan. Okay. So in that, which are the semi-essential amino acids? Yes, histidine and arginine. Yes, arginine and histidine are the semi-essential, but there is actually a lot of debate going on that area, whether they are semi-essential or they are also essential. That is still a debate topic. So better you stick as far as for your syllabus is concerned, they are considered to be semi-essential, but we can consider them more as an essential. At times, some questions have come like essential amino acids itself. Okay, so don't confuse. Don't say, okay, oh no, this is not there, no, this is semi-essential. So not like that. Some questions are framed based on the fact that they are also essential. Okay, so don't, if at all a semi-essential kind of specific question is asked, you can go with it. Otherwise, if the question is as if like essential amino acids and these options are given, that also you try to include, because certain examiners, they frame the question like considering arginine and histidine to be essential. Okay. So that is the formula. So rest of the amino acids are all not essential because our body can synthesize them. Sorry. So next, so one classification of amino acid is based on the essential, non-essential, and semi-essential. That is one set of classification of amino acid. Now the second set is based on the metabolic fate. Like, they act as precursors of what? For fat synthesis means they are ketogenic amino acids. Example is leucine and lysine. Glucogenic and ketogenic means precursor for both fat as well as glucose, synthesis of glucose or various glucose utilizing pathways. Okay, those include phenylalanine, tryptophan, tyrosine, and isoleucine. While rest all amino acids are glucogenic amino acids. So this also is very important. In this, you can try to remember ketogenic and this second one, glucogenic and ketogenic. Then rest all comes under glucogenic amino acids, because these are a few which is easy for you to remember. Always phenylalanine, tyrosine, and tryptophan, they form a single, they come together in many things. So that is glucogenic and ketogenic. In that, see, leucine, lysine, and isoleucine, again, they form a club. So in that, only isoleucine jumps to glucogenic and ketogenic. You can remember ketogenic amino acids are lysine, and leucine. Isoleucine, jump that to glucogenic and ketogenic section with phenylalanine, tyrosine, and tryptophan. Okay. Rest all are glucogenic amino acids. Now, based on structure, as I told you, but differences in the side chain. Okay, they are considered to be aliphatics, means if they have a carbon or hydrogen side chain, then they are valine, leucine, and isoleucine, like they are branch chain amino acids. Then hydroxyl group containing are serine, threonine, tyrosine. Very, very important. Sulfur containing amino acids. See, from this section, you can get or expect questions. Okay. So, amino acid with an indole ring is tryptophan, with an imidazole ring is histidine. Then aromatic amino acids are phenylalanine, tyrosine, and tryptophan. That's why I told you they form a group. Then sulfur containing is cysteine, and methionine. Okay. Then basic amino acid is lysine, arginine, and histidine. Okay. Then acidic is aspartame and glutamate, where another carboxylic group forms a side chain, whereas basic means another amino group forms a side chain. So this also is very important. Okay. Now the fourth question: coagulated proteins are. So we have left the amino acid part. Amino acids, they join together to form the proteins, or they are the basic structural unit of a protein. Now coming to the classification of proteins, that is where coagulated protein comes. Yes, they are derived proteins. Very good. So proteins can be broadly divided into simple, conjugated, and derived. Simple means they are the amino acids joined together to form a protein. So they are just simple. They are not attached to any other compound. So they are just a polypeptide chain. Okay. So in that albumin, globulin, collagen, elastin, all those are simple proteins. Whereas when they get conjugated with some other compounds, like globin combining with heme to form hemoglobin, DNA and RNA, again various proteins are all getting combined with some other nucleic acids and all those things, and hence they are conjugated proteins. Derived proteins means after some reaction, the proteins are whatever end product proteins that we are receiving, that is a derived protein. That means if the primary means we are coagulating the protein, and so those coagulated proteins are called as primary proteins, primary derived proteins, whereas peptones and peptides, which are formed as a result of proteolysis or in a breakdown of a protein, leads to formation of peptones and peptides. So those are the secondary derived proteins. So they are derivatives of some alteration in the normal protein structure. That's it. Okay. So this is a major classification of protein. In biochemistry, important is the classification, the cycle, each cycle, where it is happening, the rate limiting step, and a few important enzyme parts, which I have discussed in the video. Go through the videos, and even for the regular batch, if possible, when you are revising biochemistry, try to take 5 or 10 minutes to go through a particular cycle or the video, because I have added little more points in the video. When it came to a video, a recorded video, we have practiced a lot and recorded the video. So because of that, we could include little more, or we could bring about little more finesse in the videos. Okay. So even the regular batch students who have already gone through those sections, I just want all of you to just try to go through the video, at least the important pathways. If you leave the classification things and all, it's fine. But if you can, for the pathways and all, if you can go through the video, it will be much helpful for you. You will get additional information on that. Okay. All are true about denaturation of proteins, except. So what is protein denaturation? We are actually modifying the structure of proteins. Because of that, only the basic primary structure of the protein remains, whereas the secondary, tertiary, and quaternary structure of proteins gets altered, or they loses that secondary, tertiary, and quaternary structural alignments. So they loses their biological activity, because the biological activity of a protein is brought about only by a secondary, tertiary, or quaternary configuration. Primary structure as such cannot bring about biological activity. So here in denaturation, all are true except the disruption of primary structure. So unfolding, yes, the protein gets unfolded in denaturation. Then I told you sequence of amino acid remains the same. That means the primary structure is what is the sequence of amino acids, right? So that remains the same. And since secondary, tertiary, and quaternary structures are damaged, they lose their biological activity. But there is no alteration in the primary structure of protein. So that here the answer is option B. Okay, rest all are true about denaturation. So this is a structure of protein. So in the primary structure is the amino acid are held together by peptide bonds to form a polypeptide chain. So that is the primary structure of protein. So after protein synthesis, like in transcription and translation, from what we are receiving out of the ribosome, that is the primary structure of the protein. Now they undergo post-translational modification to form the secondary, tertiary, and the quaternary configurations. Okay, so secondary configuration is like, hydrogen bonds come into play between them so that they form two important configurations in secondary structure, that is alpha helix and beta plated sheet. Now these again are brought together by various other bonds like hydrogen bonds, ionic bonds, covalent bonds, sulfur bonds, etc. to form a much more complicated tertiary structure. Finally, we come to the quaternary structure where more than one polypeptide chains are joined together. Okay, so that is a quaternary structure of protein. Whenever denaturation happens, then secondary, tertiary, and quaternary structures are lost. Only the primary structure remains. So the basic sequence of amino acids are not altered. Okay, only the protein loses its biological activity because the secondary, tertiary, and quaternary configurations are lost. Is it clear for you? Is it okay? Okay. Now, transamination reaction is catalyzed by. So first tell me, before going to the answer, tell me what is meant by transamination. This section also, this transamination, deamination also, I request all of you to go through the video. It's a very important video, okay? Yes, transamination. So there is transfer of an amino group. Okay, is what is happening in transamination reaction. Okay, so here, which is the enzyme that is involved in transamination reaction? We say like those enzymes involved are called as transaminases, or they're also called as pyridoxal phosphate, not, no. Which is the enzyme which is involved in transamination reaction? They're called as transaminases or aminotransferases. So here the answer is option D, both A and C. Transamination reaction is catalyzed by the set of enzymes called as transaminases, or they're otherwise called as aminotransferases. So both A and C are synonyms. Okay, so the answer is option D, both A and C. This is the transamination reaction. Actually, now we saw amino acids are there. They form the proteins. Okay. Now these amino acids, we would have discussed in the amino acid pool, where what are the inputs and what are all the outputs. Now they have to undergo some metabolic process. That process is, first step is called as transamination. See, everything in our body needs a recycling, right? So how that is metabolized in our body, that's first step is called as transamination. So here, then amino group is transferred from an alpha amino acid to form an alpha keto acid by the enzyme, set of enzymes called as aminotransferases. Okay, so here the question was how they catalyzed by. Catalysis is actually, enzymes are considered to be biocatalysts, right? And that is why we have mentioning the enzymes, not the pyridoxal phosphate. That is not actually an enzyme. It is a cofactor kind of thing, or a coenzyme kind of thing. Okay. So PLP is actually like a coenzyme form of the vitamin. So that is why that is not the answer. We are stressing on, means catalyst means something that increases the rate of reaction or lowers the activation energy. Enzymes, they are considered to be the biocatalyst of the living system. And that is why the answer is option D, both A and C, and not pyridoxal phosphate. Don't confuse, like pyridoxal phosphate is essential for the reaction, but they are not the enzyme part. They are the coenzyme part. Okay, that is why Option B is not the correct answer. You should be very specific. Such tricky questions can always be present in the NEET examination. So please read the question properly and go with the answer. So the most common one that gets involved is alpha ketoglutarate getting converted into L-glutamate. Okay. So here the thing is there is no net loss of amino group. We are not removing the amino group. It is just getting transferred. Okay, from one type of amino acid to another type. That's it. Okay, so this is just getting transferred. There is no net loss of amino group. Okay, and the enzymes involved are the transaminases or aminotransferases. The most common ones are like SGOT, that is aspartate transaminase, also called as glutamate oxaloacetate transaminase. Okay, serum glutamate oxaloacetate transaminase means SGOT. Then again, alanine transaminases, that is ALT, also that serum glutamate pyruvate transaminase, that is SGPT. SGOT and SGPT are the two important transaminases or aminotransferases present in our body. Okay, so the most common amino acid that undergoes transamination is conversion of alpha ketoglutarate to L-glutamate. Exception for transamination includes lysine, threonine, proline, and hydroxyproline. They does not undergo transamination reaction. Okay, that also is a very important MCQ question. Lysine, threonine, proline, and hydroxyproline does not undergo transamination reaction. After transamination, now the amino group is just transferred. Now we have to remove the amino group from our body. How is that possible? Okay, we'll just finish this question and then move on to the next step. The coenzyme for glutamate dehydrogenase in oxidative deamination. So that is what is the concept. We have to remove the amino group from our body, which is actually increased levels of that amino in our body is not good. We have to remove them in the form of ammonia, which should be excreted from our body. Okay, so that is done by the process called as oxidative deamination. Deamination means we are removing that amino group. That is how the amino acids are getting metabolized. So this is second step in amino acid metabolism. First step is transamination. Next is deamination, especially oxidative deamination, which is the most common process that involves. So as we told you, as I've already told you, the end product in this transamination is glutamate or glutamic acid, right? Now, that has to be undergoing oxidative deamination by the enzyme glutamate dehydrogenase. So, which is a coenzyme for this reaction, oxidative deamination? Anyone? Okay, I'll tell you the answer is option C, both of the above or all of the above, because glutamate dehydrogenase is a very unique enzyme, where the NAD plus as well as NADP plus both can act as a coenzyme for glutamate dehydrogenase reaction. That is the oxidative deamination reaction. So glutamate dehydrogenase is unique in its property that both NAD plus as well as NADP plus can act as a coenzyme for that reaction. Okay, so glutamate, whichever is formed after transamination, rapidly undergo oxidative deamination by the enzyme, catalyzed by the enzyme glutamate dehydrogenase to liberate ammonia. So this enzyme is unique that it can utilize both NAD or NADP plus as a coenzyme. Okay, so this is the deamination that we have already explained. Now this ammonia that is removed after oxidative deamination enters the urea cycle and it gets excreted from the body, because increased levels of ammonia getting deposited in the body is a very harmful thing for our body. Okay, now we were talking mostly about oxidative deamination, but certain amino acids undergo non-oxidative deamination. Examples include histidine, cysteine, serine, and threonine. These are the four important amino acids that undergo non-oxidative deamination. This also is very important. Now, next is we are moving on to urea cycle. The key enzyme in urea cycle. Anyone? Yeah, very good. Carbamoyl phosphate synthase, right? So, this is a urea cycle, also called as ornithine cycle or Krebs-Hanslett cycle. It occurs in cytoplasm as well as mitochondria. That is mainly it occurs in the liver. Okay, the organ is liver, whereas within the cell it occurs in cytoplasm and mitochondria. Okay, so what happens? Those ammonia combines with carbon dioxide. Ammonia released after the deamination combines with carbon dioxide in the presence of the enzyme carbamoyl phosphate synthase, which is a rate limiting step to form carbamoyl phosphate. Now, this carbamoyl phosphate reacts with ornithine to form citrulline. Then arginosuccinase is formed, which forms arginine. And as a byproduct, fumarate is released, okay, which can go for various other reactions. So it's an important byproduct in urea cycle, fumarate. Then arginine finally forms urea, and then also ornithine is regenerated in the reaction. In this, till the formation of citrulline, that is carbamoyl phosphate combining with ornithine to form citrulline, till that step, it occurs in the mitochondria. Rest of the reactions occurs in the cytoplasm. So the carbamoyl phosphate synthase, which is a rate limiting step in urea cycle, is actually present within the mitochondria. So the initial, these many steps occurs within the mitochondria, and then once citrulline is formed, it moves out to the cytoplasm and rest of the cycle occurs. In this, only this enzyme you should remember. This enzyme only is important for you, and this is the rate limiting step also. You have to just know which all steps in mitochondria and which all in cytoplasm. The important byproduct is fumarate, and ornithine is regenerated in the reaction. Okay, that's about urea cycle. And don't confuse it with Krebs cycle. Krebs cycle means that is citric acid cycle. It is Krebs-Hanslett cycle is what is urea cycle. That is another area where everyone used to get confused. Okay, is that clear? Shall I proceed? Otherwise, we'll be very late, running late for the rest of the important pathways. Shall I move? Okay. Which of the following is a post-transcriptional modification? So now we have come to protein synthesis now. Okay. So which is a post-transcriptional modification? Yes, all of the above. Very good. That was a very quick reply from your side. Great. So now tell me about DNA, protein synthesis. Which are the, always they say it is transcription and translation, but for your level, you should say there are 4 steps, that is transcription, post-transcriptional modification, translation, and post-translational modification. Transcription means it's a formation of a messenger RNA from a DNA template. Okay, DNA is getting converted into an mRNA. Then mRNA forms protein. That is what is translation. So transcription is DNA forming a mRNA. Okay, so in the transcription, initiation by the binding of the enzyme, the RNA polymerase 2 in the promoter region. Okay, then this leads to opening up of the helix. Okay, DNA double helix gets opened. Always remember, always the parent strand when it comes to synthesis of protein as well as DNA replication or whatever it is. Always the parent key strand in the DNA double helix will be 3' 5' strand. Okay, then only the produced mRNA will be in the 5' 3' direction, that is in the reverse direction or complementary to that parent strand. So always remember the parent strand is 3' 5' strand, which is indicated in that red one. Okay, the 3' 5' strand is the parent strand. Okay, once the RNA polymerase enzyme binds to the promoter region, which has specific sites in the DNA, then the the complementary strand starts coming, and the DNA double helix opens and the complementary nucleotide bases comes and attaches to form the complementary strand in the 5' 3' direction. So when it encounters a stop sequence like UAA, UAG or UGA, there that elongation stops. That what leads to termination of the mRNA synthesis or termination of transcription, and that mRNA, which is a primary transcript form, is released in the 5' 3' direction. Okay, try to remember this picture. Now, after this transcription, next is post-transcriptional modification. That is a primary mRNA is deficient in many things. We need to modify it. Okay, make it into a very functional finished mRNA. So those are three things. First is called a splicing or removal of introns, which are the non-coding portions are all removed, and all the exons, which are the coding portions, are all joined together. That is the first type of post-transcriptional modification. Second one is on the head end, that is a 5' end. We are doing a capping. That is why 5' capping is done by 7-methyl guanosil, which helps to stabilize the mRNA structure. And then at the tail end, that is a 3' end, multiple adenosine units are added to form a poly A tail. Okay, multiple adenosine nucleotides are added. This also is done to stabilize both the head and the tail of the mRNA. Okay, that is how the post-transcriptional modifications are done. Once this is done, this finished mRNA moves out from within the nucleus, because DNA was present in the nucleus, right? So it moves out from the nucleus into the cytoplasm towards a ribosome. In the ribosome is where you have the translation, and the, after coming out of the ribosome, post-translational modifications are done. Okay, so anticodons are present on. So what does mean by codon? Okay, the answer is correct. tRNA, yes. Codons means what? These are triplet codes, right? Which codes for a particular amino acids, right? So these are the genetic codes, triplet codes, which are present, or 3 nucleic acids or nucleic bases. When they come together, it forms a triplet code. Yes, example is AUG, which is always the initiating codon. Okay, so codons, codons are present actually on the mRNA. Codons are present on the mRNA. So corresponding complementary to it, whatever is present, those are called as anticodons, and those are present on the tRNA. There is a transfer RNA. See what happens, as I told you. So this is the same explanation already given. Okay. Now the translation, the finished mRNA comes out from the nucleus and into the cytoplasm, attaches itself onto the ribosome. Okay, so this you can see 3 nucleotide bases together. So that is a codon which is present on the mRNA. Now the tRNA, the role is, see, this is a tRNA, clover leaf shape. Okay, so it has a corresponding anticodon. Corresponding complementary is U. So then, because it is an actually, these are all RNAs, and hence adenine, guanine, thymine, and cytosine in the DNA only. RNA, instead you have uracil. Okay, so that is why instead of A pairing with, here what comes is U. Okay, please bear that in mind. Whenever you write the codes and all, you should be very specific. If it is RNA, always replace with uracil. Don't forget to replace it with uracil. So here the tRNA is cloverleaf shaped. Okay, so it has the corresponding anticodons in it. So what it does, it is called as transfer RNA. Okay, so it goes to the amino acid pool based on the anticodon in this arm. It takes the corresponding amino acid, okay, on the other end. Okay, get it here, and here when it just joins, these are all joined together by peptide bonds. Okay, so once those are all joined together by peptide bonds, they release that amino acid, and then they move away. So that is how, like a cycle, the polypeptide chain is getting elongated to form the primary structure of protein. So that is a translation. Once the primary structure is formed, it undergoes post-translational modifications, like configuring themselves to secondary, tertiary, and quaternary structure, so that it becomes biologically active. Okay, that is post-translational modification. Is it clear? This is about protein synthesis. Is it clear for you? Are you able to follow? Why no reaction? You all forgot biochemistry. Most of you have gone through it, no? Okay. Now, let's move on to carbohydrates and their metabolism. So altogether, I have tried to stress the important areas in proteins and metabolism. Go through the video. Any doubt, you can message and ask me. Okay. Now, carbohydrates and their metabolism. First, we'll just immediately go to the various important cycles, because in this we have a lot of cycles to cover. First one and the most important is the glycolysis, because the emergency energy yielding pathway in our body. Whatever carbohydrates we take through the diet, it's immediately broken down to release glucose 4, and then that enters a glycolytic pathway to release the energy. Okay, so it's an emergency energy yielding pathway in our body. The rate limit glycolysis means breakdown or breaking down of glucose. Okay, now the rate limiting step in glycolysis is catalyzed by the enzyme. Very simple question, no? Yes, it is phosphofructokinase. Okay, yes. So glycolysis, otherwise also called as Embden-Meyhoff pathway, very essential for the brain and major energy source for RBC, cornea, and lens. So glycolysis, it occurs in the cytoplasm. That site where the various cycles occur is very, very important. Urea cycle, I told you, it's both mitochondria, half in mitochondria, half in cytoplasm. Now glycolysis, it solely occurs in cytoplasm. So there are two types, mostly is aerobic glycolysis. End product is pyruvate, forming 8 ATPs. Then very rarely anaerobic glycolysis, forming lactate, and only 2 ATPs are net generated. See, this is actually the net ATP is generated. Okay, apart from whatever was utilized, the net ATP generated in aerobic glycolysis is 8, while anaerobic glycolysis is 2. So this is a glycolysis pathway can split it into two. There is a preparatory phase and the payoff phase. The preparatory phase, the thing is 2 ATPs are getting utilized. Okay, say first step is glucose acted upon by hexokinase or glucokinase to form glucose 6-phosphate. Then an isomerase enzyme forming it into an isomeric form fructose 6-phosphate. Then comes a rate limiting step, which is a phosphofructokinase forming fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. So here, the first step, glucose to glucose 6-phosphate, a phosphate group is getting added at the 6th carbon position. Glucose is a 6 carbon atom. Okay, it's a 6 carbon atom. So here, the 6th position of the 6th carbon atom, a phosphate group is getting added. So where is it coming from? It is being taken from the ATP. Okay, so that is why ATP is getting converted into ADP, because one phosphate is being removed. Similarly, in this third step also, again, fructose 6-phosphate is getting converted into fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. That is, again, one more phosphate group is getting added at the first carbon atom. And that is why, again, one ATP is utilized to release ADP on it. Then this is the rate limiting step, and it is also, the enzyme is phosphofructokinase. Okay, so kinase enzyme is, it's a high energy compound reactions always happening. So there should be an involvement of an energy transfer with a phosphate group. So that is like whenever kinase, when you hear the term kinase enzyme, you should remember something is getting, some high energy compound is getting added up or removed, or it's losing a phosphate group, or an phosphate group is getting added up. That you have to always keep in mind. Then aldolase enzyme acts on this, forms 2 compounds actually. So this till fructose 1,6-bisphosphate, it was a 6 carbon compound. Now after that, we are splitting that into 3 carbon compounds, that is glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate and dihydroxyacetone phosphate. But this dihydroxyacetone phosphate immediately, or most of the times, it just it's a reversible reaction, so it just immediately gets converted into glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate by the isomerase enzyme again. So that is why at the end of the preparatory phase, one glucose is getting converted into 2 molecules, net 2 molecules of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate is getting formed. Then only the number of carbon atoms is actually correct. See, we started with a 6 carbon compound. So when you get 2 molecules of a 3 carbon compound only, then that number of carbon atoms will be correct. Okay, so that is about the preparatory phase. And see, there is some important confusion. There is a question now always they ask, which is what is the difference between a rate limiting step and a committed step? See, rate limiting step means the slowest step in the pathway is called as a rate limiting step. Okay, while that is why the rate limiting step is important. It is a slower step in the pathway, whereas committed step means what they usually say is when that whichever step that where after which that compound is more committed to that pathway, that is called as committed step. So those committed steps means actually they say they are irreversible steps. So as far as glycolysis is concerned, there are 3 irreversible steps. One is the first step, then the second one is a third step, and finally it is in the payoff phase that I will show you. So always there was a confusion, and I also made a mistake telling you that the first committed step in glycolysis pathway is the first step. No, I now let me come to another explanation for it, because even though this is a irreversible step, glucose getting converted to glucose 6-phosphate is an irreversible step in glycolysis. Yes, I agree, but still this glucose 6-phosphate can act as a primary compound in various other reactions. So even after the formation of glucose 6-phosphate, this, or even the formation of fructose 6-phosphate, that is not committed to this glycolysis alone. When it only gets converted into this third step, that is fructose 6-phosphate to fructose 1,6-bisphosphate, then only that compound is getting committed to glycolysis. Okay, so that is why even though the first step in glycolysis is an irreversible reaction, that is not the committed step. Whatever they have given in pulse is correct. Actually, the first committed step in glycolysis is step 3. Okay, because after fructose 1,6-bisphosphate is formed, then only the compound is getting committed to the pathway. Because glucose 6-phosphate can act as a important precursor for various other pathways also. Okay, so first committed step, I repeat, the first committed step in glycolysis is the rate limiting step itself, that is fructose 6-phosphate getting converted into fructose 1,6-bisphosphate, where phosphofructokinase is the enzyme involved. So that is not only the rate limiting step in glycolysis, but that is also the first committed step in glycolysis. Okay, so this is the main key point. We always say it is an irreversible committed step, means that should be an irreversible step. Yes, even though the first step is irreversible, even after formation of glucose 6-phosphate, it is not committed just entirely to glycolysis. So that is why the third step, that is a rate limiting step itself, is the first committed step in glycolysis. I hope that is pakka clear. Please note it down or correct in your notes. Okay. So whatever given in pulse is correct. So I'm moving on the payoff phase. So from this point, you should always remember 2 molecules of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate is getting involved, getting converted into 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. Again, here glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase enzyme is getting acted. So because of that, 2 NAD plus molecules are getting converted into 2 NADH. Okay. Then next is the substrate level phosphorylation step. Again, a kinase enzyme is getting active, and since I told you it's everything is 2 molecules, 2 ATPs are generated in this step. Okay, so substrate level phosphorylation means directly ATPs are formed, whereas this NADH, actually whatever is generated, actually that also is an energy compound, but the problem is it has to go through the electron transport chain for it to become ATPs and to release energy. Okay, so wherever directly ATPs are formed, those steps are called as substrate level phosphorylation. And 1 molecule of NADH is equivalent to 3 molecules of ATPs when it enters the electron transport chain. Now, after 3-phosphoglycerate is the mutase enzyme forming 2-phosphoglycerate. Then enolase enzyme acts on it. That is where the fluoride inhibition occurs in glycolysis, forming phosphoenol pyruvate. Then again, a kinase enzyme getting acted, and hence here 2 ATPs are formed, and because of that, it is again a substrate level phosphorylation step, ultimately forms pyruvate. That is about aerobic glycolysis. So imagine how many molecules of ATPs. This 2 NADH means 6 ATP, 6, then here 2, 8 plus 2, 10. But since in the preparatory phase 2 ATPs were utilized, net generated is only 8. Okay, now what is happening in anaerobic glycolysis? This pyruvate is acted upon by lactate dehydrogenase to form lactate. In this step, in anaerobic glycolysis, because usually the pyruvate has to go to that intermediate step and enter citric acid cycle, but citric acid cycle works only under aerobic conditions. So in anaerobic condition, this pyruvate cannot stay like that. it immediately gets converted into lactate in anaerobic conditions with the enzyme lactate dehydrogenase. So in this step, 2 molecules of NADH are utilized. So this whatever was generated, net we can say this was utilized in this step in anaerobic glycolysis. So altogether 2 plus 2 only 4 ATPs in the payoff phase. Since 2 was already utilized in the preparatory phase, net produced in anaerobic glycolysis is only 2 ATP. Okay, so that is how the calculation of ATP generation comes in glycolysis. Glycolysis, this much I stress because I wanted all of you to go through that very properly. Okay, is it okay? Shall I proceed? Because we still need to go through a lot of topics. Okay, shall I move? You can go through the video. I have tried to explain my best in the video. Please go through it. Okay. Now, this is what I told you, glycolysis versus gluconeogenesis. So here, I told you gluconeogenesis means what? Formation of new glucose from non-carbohydrate molecules. Okay. So glycolysis, I told there are 3 irreversible steps. That is the first step, the second, the third step, and finally conversion of phosphoenol pyruvate to pyruvate. That is this step. Okay. So that is the third irreversible step in glycolysis. Okay. So gluconeogenesis means this entire pathway is getting reversed. Only that all the compounds, everything is the same, and even the enzyme, except for these 3 steps, that enzymes differ. That is pyruvate, directly it is not getting converted into phosphoenol pyruvate. Instead, pyruvate is getting converted first to oxaloacetate within the mitochondria by pyruvate carboxylase. Okay, in gluconeogenesis, this step is occurring within the mitochondria. Then this oxaloacetate moves outside into the cytoplasm and forms, with the help of phosphoenol pyruvate carboxykinase, it forms phosphoenol pyruvate. Then again, alteration is in the third step when it comes back to this step. Okay, entire reaction getting reversed. You imagine like that. When it comes to this step, the rate limiting step in glycolysis, similarly, that also the enzyme is differing in gluconeogenesis. That is fructose 1,6 bisphosphatase is the enzyme. And since this was the rate limiting step in glycolysis, again, this is the rate limiting step as well as the enzyme in gluconeogenesis. Again, a change in enzyme is for the first step in glycolysis when it comes to gluconeogenesis. That is glucose 6 phosphatase is the enzyme involved. So the entire, imagine gluconeogenesis means the entire pathway getting reversed. Only thing is all the intermediate compounds and everything is the same, except for the 3 irreversible steps in glycolysis. For that, in gluconeogenesis, there are different enzymes. Instead of these 3 enzymes, we are having 4 enzymes in gluconeogenesis. That is the only difference between glycolysis and gluconeogenesis. Okay. Now, it's the formation of glucose from non-carbohydrate precursors. So the precursors are usually, when it is lactate, we say it is Cori cycle. If it is pyruvate is a precursor, we say it is pyruvate alanine cycle. Then various glycerol or glucogenic amino acids all can get converted into various intermediate compounds and leads to gluconeogenesis. Okay. Whenever our body is in demand. Sorry. Yeah. Now we are moving on to citric acid cycle, which is the rate limiting enzyme in citric acid cycle. By fumarase, it is isocitrate dehydrogenase, not succinate thiokinase. That is the, the substrate level phosphorylation step in citric acid cycle. Rate limiting enzyme in citric acid cycle is isocitrate dehydrogenase. Okay. See, citric acid cycle is the final common oxidative pathway for carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. So citric acid cycle occurs in the mitochondria. It is an aerobic path. It occurs only in the presence of oxygen, only under aerobic condition. Since it occurs in mitochondria, it does not occur in tissues which lack mitochondria, such as erythrocytes, cornea, lens, etc. And here, 3 acids are formed. That is citrate, cis-aconitate, and isocitrate. And hence, this is also called as tricarboxylic acid cycle. Then another name for citric acid cycle is Krebs cycle. Okay. So Before the pyruvate entering into the citric acid cycle, there is an intermediate step called as oxidative decarboxylation. So two molecules of pyruvate at the end of glycolysis acted upon by CoASH, and wherein NAD plus is getting converted to form NADH and carbon dioxide. So that two molecules of NADH, that is 6 ATPs net, is produced in this step to get converted into acetyl-CoA. So this is by a very multi-enzyme complex called as pyruvate dehydrogenase complex is the one that acts in this step. Okay, so in the presence of various coenzymes like TPP, lipomide, FAD, coenzyme A, and NAD+, all these coenzymes are essential for this multi-enzyme complex to act. It converts pyruvate into acetyl-CoA with the production of two molecules of NADH. That means net 6 ATPs are generated in this step. Then it moves to citric acid cycle. Okay, so that acetyl-CoA, whatever is generated, enters citric acid cycle in the presence of citrate synthase enzyme to form citrate, then acted upon by aconitase enzyme to form aconitate, which again aconitase enzyme acts to form deisocitrate. Someone has unmuted. Please mute yourself. Now the isocitrate is getting converted into alpha ketoglutarate with the enzyme isocitrate dehydrogenase. That is a rate limiting step in the citric acid cycle. In this, again, the dehydrogenase enzyme is acted, and hence NAD plus is getting converted into NADH. And also remember, we are actually two acetyl-CoA molecules are entering the reaction. Okay, so here also everything is happening twice. So two NADH actually should be formed. And then alpha ketoglutarate, again a dehydrogenase enzyme forming succinyl-CoA. So again, two NADH molecules were produced. Then succinate thiokinase enzyme acting, which is where substrate level phosphorylation occurs, producing succinate. So here, in the substrate level phosphorylation, the high energy compound that is formed is not ATP, it is actually GTP. One GTP is equivalent to one ATP only, and hence we can consider that also as a substrate level phosphorylation step. Succinate dehydrogenase enzyme acting to form fumarate. So again, here it is actually FADH2 is what is formed, which is equivalent to 2 molecules of ATP. NADH was equivalent to 3 molecules of ATP, while FADH is equivalent to 2 molecules of ATP. Fumarate by fumarase enzyme to form malate, malate forming oxaloacetate, again a dehydrogenase enzyme, and hence again 2 molecules of NADH were formed. So this, wherever dehydrogenase enzyme acting, just remember either NADH or FADH is produced. Okay, only the difference is coming here. Succinate dehydrogenase, only there FADH2 is produced, rest all is NADH. So altogether, just by citric acid alone, considering 2 molecules of acetyl-CoA entering the reaction, 24 ATPs are generated. Okay. So here, don't forget in the cycle here, it is a substrate level phosphorylation step forming a molecule of GTP. So 2 molecules means 2 molecules of GTP is what is formed in this step. Okay, that also you should add. Now, total ATP per molecule of glucose under aerobic condition. So glucose under aerobic condition means total ATP is what they are telling. So you should even include the citric acid cycle. Okay. Yes, it is 38. Okay, very good. Don't forget it, very important. Glycolysis under aerobic condition is 8. Pyruvate to acetyl-CoA, that intermediate step, 6 molecules of ATP net. Citric acid cycle 24, altogether 38 molecules of ATP under aerobic condition from 1 molecule of glucose. Okay. Now, which of the following statement is not true? So it's about HMP shunt or hexose monophosphate shunt. Option A is correct. HMP shunt stands for hexose monophosphate shunt. Correct. Then HMP shunt does not generate carbon dioxide. That is not true, because HMP shunt carbon dioxide molecules are produced. Because see here in HMP shunt, the important concept of that pathway is we are getting actually pentose sugars. So it two byproducts are formed as a result of HMP shunt. One is the formation of pentose sugar, and another is the formation of very important high energy compound, very important compound, not high energy compound, I should say, because there is no net generation or utilization of ATPs happening in this HMP shunt. Okay, so we are producing a very important compound called as NADPH. Okay, and hence it is a, so we are going to produce pentose sugar, whereas initial input compound is actually a hexose sugar. That is, it is a 6-carbon sugar that is entering the reaction. At the end, we are only producing a 5-carbon sugar. So where is that carbon atom, one carbon atom going? That is released as carbon dioxide in the HMP shunt pathway. Okay, so that is why here the answer is option B, because HMP shunt does generate carbon dioxide. Okay, carbon dioxide is produced as a byproduct in HMP shunt. It does not generate ATP. Yes, ATP is neither utilized nor produced in HMP shunt. Then this reaction takes place in cytoplasm. That is true. Okay. So it's also called as pentose phosphate pathway. Okay, so it's an alternative to glycolysis and Krebs cycle for the production of, or for the oxidation of glucose. Okay, occurs mainly in liver, adipose tissue, testes, WBC, etc. It is occurs in the cytoplasm. So two important byproducts like NADPH and pentose sugars. So it has two phases, oxidative and non-oxidative phase. So in the oxidative phase is what that carbon dioxide is getting removed. Okay, so the input component, that see here, see glucose 6-phosphate. So after glucose getting converted into glucose 6-phosphate in glycolysis, or the first step in glycolysis, then glucose 6-phosphate either can proceed with, you know, glycolysis, or it can proceed with HMP shunt. And that is why we told that step is not committed. Even though that is an irreversible reaction, that is not committed to glycolysis. Okay, so that is why this can also act as an important input or the precursor compound in HMP shunt. Okay, now this glucose 6-phosphate acted upon by the enzyme G6P dehydrogenase, that is glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase enzyme, which is the rate limiting step to form 6-phosphogluconolactone. So that is a rate limiting step in HMP shunt. And see again a dehydrogenase enzyme. So here that NADP plus is getting converted into NADP. Please remember, it is not NAD plus getting converted to NADH. No, that is actually energy compounds. While here this NADPH is not an energy compound. It is important input for fatty acid, steroid and amino acid synthesis and all. Okay. So that NADH and NADPH both are different. Okay, so here this dehydrogenase enzyme is role in production of NADPH. So the important proton acceptor here is NADP plus. Okay, that P is very important. Now 6-phosphogluconolactone acted upon by gluconolactonase to form 6-phosphogluconate. Now this 6-phosphogluconate is getting converted into a pentose sugar. The first pentose sugar formed at the end of oxidative phase in HMP shunt was ribulose 5-phosphate. So the first pentose sugar formed in HMP shunt is ribulose 5-phosphate. Very important question. Here also a dehydrogenase enzyme, and hence again NADPH is formed. And one molecule of carbon dioxide is removed because this 6-carbon compound is getting converted into a pentose, that is 5-carbon compound. So that extra carbon atom is removed in the form of carbon dioxide. We always assume 3 molecules of glucose 6-phosphate enters the HMP shunt, and hence 3 molecules of carbon dioxide is getting removed. Similarly, here also 3 NADPH is getting formed. Here also 3 NADPH is getting formed. Now, non-oxidative phase, this ribulose 5-phosphate by various isomerase and epimerase enzyme form ribose 5-phosphate and xylulose 5-phosphate. See, I told you ribulose 5-phosphate. Here I asked you to assume 3 molecules are getting formed, right? So 3 ribulose 5-phosphate were formed. Now this 3 ribulose 5-phosphate. Okay, so it forms 2 xylulose 5-phosphate and 1 ribose 5-phosphate. Okay, in that 1 ribose 5-phosphate and 1 xylulose 5-phosphate. Okay, combined together in the presence of enzyme transketolase. And so here, just imagine it is 5 and 5, 5 and 5. Now that configuration is altogether 10, right? 10 carbon atom. So another 5, that is 1 more xylulose 5-phosphate was formed. Actually, that is enters the reaction in the last step only. So that is kept there itself. Now 5 plus 5, you imagine 10 carbon. Okay, now this 5 plus 5 configuration is getting altered by trans-ketolase enzyme to form a 3 plus 7 configuration. That is glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, where only 3 carbon compound plus pseudoheptulose 7-phosphate, which is a 7 carbon compound. So it's actually, if you can remember 5 and 5, getting converted into 7 plus 3 or 7 plus 3 configuration. This names also, it will be very easy for to recollect. Okay, pseudoheptulose 7-phosphate and glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. So that is 7 plus 3. Again, there is 10. Now trans-aldolase acts and forms a 6 carbon compound again, that is fructose 6-phosphate. So that can re-enter the reaction of glycolysis or whatever pathways it is needed. And again a 4 carbon one. So 6 plus 4 configuration, 7 plus 3 getting converted into 6 plus 4 configuration. The 6 carbon compound fructose 6-phosphate can re-enter reactions like glycolysis and all. Now this erythrose 4-phosphate that combines with that one more xylulose 5-phosphate which is already formed in this step. Okay, with a 4 plus 5 combination forming again glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate and one more fructose 6-phosphate. Okay, so that is how this reaction occurs. Okay, so that's about HMP shunt. So these compounds, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate and fructose 6-phosphate, can enter glycolysis at whatever intermediate steps is possible. Okay, so no ATP is produced nor utilized in the reaction of HMP shunt. Net energy yield from pentose phosphate pathway. Excuse me, someone has unmuted. Please mute your mics. All of you, can you please mute your mic? Thank you. So here, yes, the answer is option B, 0, right? So ATP is neither utilized nor produced by HMP shunt. Not true about HMP shunt. It's very important. That's why I have tried to include as many questions as possible. It's an oxidative phase generates NADPH. Yes, that is correct, right? We saw NADPH is produced in the oxidative phase. Oxidative phase is irreversible. Yes. Then non-oxidative phase generate ribose precursors. Yes. NAD plus is the proton acceptor in the oxidative phase. Is that true? Option D. That is false because NADP plus is the proton acceptor in the oxidative phase. Okay. So that is about HMP shunt. So this, see, from this question, you should also get to know, like, you know, the oxidative phase generates NADPH. That is an important point for you to remember. It is irreversible, that oxidative phase. And then ribose precursors are formed in the non-oxidative phase. So HMP shunt has two byproducts, NADPH and ribose precursors or pentoses, right? So the NADPH is produced in the oxidative phase while the ribose precursors are produced in the non-oxidative phase. Okay. Well, the proton acceptor is NADP plus and not NAD plus. Now, which of the following is a rate limiting enzyme for the synthesis of heme? Now we have gone to the hemoglobin synthesis. So I have finished with the carbohydrate metabolism part. We'll just discuss about heme synthesis and adrenaline synthesis. So anyone? Yes, it is delta amino levulinic acid synthase 1. Okay. This is a pathway. Succinyl-CoA combining with glycine to form delta amino levulinic acid, which is the rate limiting step by the enzyme delta amino levulinic synthase, and also the cofactor enzyme is pyridoxal phosphate. Okay. Now that forms phosphobilinogen and protophosphirin ion. Then heme enzyme enzyme acts along with ferrous iron to form heme, which combines with globin to form hemoglobin. So this is an outline of hemoglobin synthesis. This much is more than sufficient. Okay, for you to know all the this much of information is sufficient as far as hemoglobin synthesis is concerned. Okay, you can go through the video. Now, what happens to the globin part of hemoglobin once it gets dissociated? So in the videos also I have explained both hemoglobin synthesis as well as how it is getting dissociated or catabolized. So what happens to the globin part? Hemoglobin means heme and globin. So hemoglobin, heme has various other steps when it gets dissociated. What happens to the globin part of hemoglobin? Anyone? It's a very easy part, no? It's a very easy question. Globin is a protein, right? Yes. So it gets degraded to its amino acid and re-enters the amino acid pool. The option C is the right answer. Hemoglobin disintegrate or getting dissociated or disintegrated by the tissue macrophage system to form heme and globin. Globin usually gets re-enters amino acid pool, whereas heme is splitted to form ferrous iron as well as the remaining part. So iron gets stored in liver as ferritin. The remaining part, the key enzyme that acts as the heme oxygenase complex to form biliverdin. Then biliverdin reductase forming bilirubin. After bilirubin is formed, this is taken up by liver. Then conjugation of bilirubin occurs in the liver, getting converted into urobilinogen and stercobilinogen, getting excreted in urine and stool as urobilin and stercobilin. Okay, so that is about the fate of hemoglobin in our body once it gets dissociated. I'm not going into in-depth. Any doubts, please go through the videos. Okay. What is a complex enzyme system for the catabolism of heme called as? It's a very easy question, no? Now only we discussed. Yes, it is heme oxygenase. Okay. The coenzyme required for the enzyme tyrosine hydroxylase is. So which is this reaction? Tyrosine hydroxylase enzyme coming, which is the cycle? Can anyone tell me? Okay, the answer, I agree, it is not fatty acid, no. Tyrosine is an amino acid, right? So it's how come it comes to fatty acid? Yes, it is catecholamine metabolism, catecholamine biosynthesis. Okay, so it is a coenzyme which is required for the enzyme tyrosine hydroxylase is tetrahydrobiopterin. Okay, so that's a catecholamine biosynthesis, and that is a rate limiting enzyme. So phenylalanine getting converted into tyrosine. Okay, tyrosine by the enzyme tyrosine hydroxylase, which is a rate limiting enzyme, with the help of cofactor that is tetrahydrobiopterin, forms DOPA. Now, DOPA gets converted or acted upon by decarboxylate to form dopamine. Dopamine gets converted into norepinephrine. Then norepinephrine undergo N-methylation reaction to form epinephrine. So that is about the catecholamine biosynthesis. Okay. Now let's move on to lipids and their metabolism. We have to finish lipids as well as the enzyme part. What is the calorific value of fat? It's a very simple question, but very important. It has been asked repeatedly. Yes, 9. So what is the calorific value of protein and carbohydrate? Yes. So what does this calorific value means? What does it mean? That means a single molecule of that compound yields how many kilocalories of energy? So 1 molecule of fat yields 9 kilocalories of energy. Okay, or 1 gram of fat yields 9 kilocalories of energy. That is why calorific value of fat is 9. Okay, so similarly, 1 gram of carbohydrate or protein yields 4 kilocalories of energy. Okay, that is how the calculation works. That is what is calorific value of fat or any other compounds, carbohydrate or protein. Okay. Now, lipids, you all know, I'm just briefly going through it. Broadly classified into simple, compound, and derived lipids. Simple lipids is they are just esters of fatty acids with glycerol. So you have the triacylglycerols, there is a fats, oils, waxes, and all comes under this. Okay, compound lipids means apart from fatty acids and alcohol, there is a glycerol mostly, otherwise any other alcohol group. It can be either phosphoric acid and nitrogenous base, then they are called as phospholipids, or it can be sugars, then they are called as glycolipids, or they can be, if protein is added, they are called as lipoproteins. Okay, so you all know what is phospholipids means. They have a fatty acid, alcohol, along with that phosphoric acid and nitrogenous bases will be present. Example is lecithin, cephalin, sphingomyelin comes under phospholipids, whereas glycolipids means fatty acids plus alcohol or maybe glycerol. Along with that, they have sugar moieties. So that is what is glycolipid. That is cerebrocytes and gangliosides are the various glycolipids. Lipoprotein means instead of that, they have the proteins. Okay, so they are lipoproteins are LDL, HDL, VLDL, chylomicrons, etc. comes under the lipoprotein part. Derived lipids, the most common or basic things what we can say is the sterols, that is cholesterol and ergosterol. Okay. So in the video, I have detailed, I have explained the various important, the chemical constitution of lecithin, cephalin, and all those things. Please go through it, and you have to try to recollect it, because sometimes, very rarely, that has been asked as a question. Okay, so you should know which is the phosphoric acid or the nitrogen base present in lecithin or cephalin and all those things. Okay, so now I'm moving on to the next section. Hypolipemic agents acts on. Hypolipemic agent means something that reduces the lipid content in our body, like statins and all. So they act on, yes, HMG-CoA reductase enzyme, because that is a rate limiting enzyme in cholesterol synthesis. Okay, so cholesterol synthesis occurs in cytoplasm and endoplasmic reticulum. Please note it down. Site is liver, intestine, and adrenal cortex. So the important input compound is acetyl-CoA. So then 2 molecules of acetyl-CoA can form acetoacetyl-CoA. So altogether 3 molecules of acetyl-CoA, that is acetyl-CoA plus acetoacetyl-CoA. In the along with the enzyme HMG-CoA synthase to form HMG-CoA. Okay, then the next step is a rate limiting step when it comes to cholesterol synthesis, where a reductase enzyme acts to form mevalonic acid. Then a mevalonate decarboxylate forms isoprenoid units. Then squalene synthase acts to form squalene and ultimately cholesterol. Okay, so here 2 molecules of NADPH is getting utilized to produce 2 molecules of NADP plus in this rate limiting step. Actually, we are utilizing some compound here for this reaction to occur. Okay, for the synthesis of cholesterol. Cholesterol is very important for our body because it is an important constitution of our cell membrane. The integrity of the cell membrane, the myelin sheath, nerves, everything, right? So cholesterol is very important. That is why I told you one of the important roles of NADPH is, see, it is getting utilized in the synthesis of cholesterol. Okay. Conversion of acetyl-CoA, melanin-CoA is a rate limiting step in fatty acid synthesis. Now cholesterol synthesis is done. We are now moving on to fatty acid synthesis. Which of the following enzyme catalyzes the reaction, converting acetyl-CoA to melanin-CoA? So just tell me, when does fatty acids get synthesized? Fatty acids has various roles in our body. So we need synthesis of fatty acids. And also whenever we have increased amounts of carbohydrates that we take up. So everything will not, there is no point in getting converted into glucose and energy. So after whatever our energy needs are met, the rest of that, whatever we are taking, they can get converted or enter the fatty acid synthesis cycle so that they can get converted into fatty acids can get stored in our body for various other processes, or we can utilize them in times of need. Okay, so that is why acetyl-CoA can, after formation, after glycolysis, pyruvate forming acetyl-CoA, that can, excess of that, instead of entering in the citric acid cycle, can get into the fatty acid synthesis to form various fatty acids, which are also essential for our body. Okay, we can utilize that fatty acids by oxidation, especially beta oxidation during times of need. Okay, so the rate limiting step in fatty acid synthesis is conversion of acetyl-CoA to melanin-CoA. So what is the enzyme which catalyzes that rate limiting reaction? It is acetyl-CoA carboxylase. Okay. This is a fatty acid synthesis which occurs in cytoplasm. So this occurs during well-fed state only, very important. So acetyl-CoA from glycolysis, and see from HMP that NADPH is needed for this reaction. Acetyl-CoA carboxylase is a rate limiting step forming malonyl-CoA. Then the fatty acid synthase complex system acts to produce palmitic acid, which is the most common fatty acid synthesized. Okay, now this palmitic acid it will be stored in our body. Whenever our body is in demand, this can enter into a oxidation or beta oxidation of fatty acids can occur to release energy. Okay, whenever we are having periods of starvation. Okay. Transfer of fatty acid across the mitochondrial membrane is brought about by. So this comes to the beta oxidation of fats. Yes, carnitine carrier system. Yes, true. So beta oxidation of fats was described by Franz Nu. Okay, so this is the energy requirement of the cell during fasting state, because we have free fatty acids in our body, or they are released from adipose tissue when we are in a fasting state. So first activation, see, fatty acid synthesis actually occurred in the cytoplasm, right? So first thing is like the fatty, excuse me, can you please mute your microphone? Now the activation of fatty acid occurs in the cytoplasm. Okay, so where the fatty acids are getting converted into their acyl CoA forms. That means palmitic acid gets converted into palmitoyl CoA, like that. Okay, so then after that activation, it should be transported into mitochondria, because beta oxidation occurs in the mitochondria by the system that is carnitine shuttle or carnitine carrier system. So oxidation as such proper occurs in the mitochondria. Okay, so one molecule of palmitic acid is supposed to produce 129 ATPs after beta oxidation. Okay, that is about the beta oxidation of fats. Now, beta oxidation of fatty acid occurs in all tissues except, which are all the tissues wherein beta oxidation is not possible. So one thing is, since it occurs in mitochondria, tissues that lack mitochondria like erythrocytes, that is possible. Then in brain and adrenal medulla also, beta oxidation of fatty acids does not occur due to various other deficiencies in, like, for the pathway, we need some points. So that is not present in brain and adrenal medulla. You don't need to go in depth into that cycle. Okay, so usually in brain and adrenal medulla and all, different other oxidation, like instead of beta oxidation, omega oxidation occurs in brain, like that. Okay, so erythrocytes, brain and adrenal medulla, beta oxidation of fatty acids, it's not possible. Okay. Concentration of ketone bodies in blood in well-fed state. So ketone bodies are produced only in periods of prolonged starvation. So usually in well-fed state, it is actually 1 mg or less than 1 mg percentage in our body. Okay. So which are all the 3 important ketone bodies? Acetone, acetoacetate, and one more, beta hydroxybutyrate. Very good. These are the 3 important ketone bodies in our body, produced in our body during periods of prolonged starvation. So they act as a major fuel source for brain and central nervous system during prolonged starvation, because our brain cannot utilize the free fatty acids for energy production. Okay. Ketone body synthesis occurs in the mitochondria, in the liver from fatty acids. So the 3 important ketone bodies are acetone, acetoacetate, and beta hydroxybutyrate. Okay, so this is here. In ketone body synthesis, the rate limiting enzyme is HMG-CoA synthase. Okay, whereas in cholesterol synthesis, it was HMG-CoA reductase. Okay, please, you should be very thorough with that. Which of the following cannot utilize ketone bodies? Yes, both erythrocytes as well as liver. See, ketone body utilization means after the ketone bodies are formed, there's something called as ketolysis that happens. So it's a reversal of the reaction that occurs so that our body can utilize the ketone bodies. But erythrocytes, since they lack mitochondria, the ketone bodies they cannot utilize, and liver lacks the enzyme thiophorase, which is essential for the utilization of ketone bodies. And because of that, even though ketone bodies are produced in liver, The utilization is not possible by liver due to the lack of enzyme thiophoresis. So answer is both A and B. In Niemann-Pick disease, the following substance accumulate in the central nervous system in excess. It's a very important repeated question. That's why I added it up. Yes, Niemann-Pick disease was due to deficiency of sphingomyelinase, and hence sphingomyelins gets deposited in excess quantities in the central nervous system in Niemann-Pick disease. So these are the various disorders of lipid metabolism. I'm not going into explanation. Actually, these things by repeated reading, you have to try to recollect it or remember it. So we have to remember the disorder name, which is the enzyme deficient, and hence what is the byproduct that is getting deposited in excess amounts. That's what you should know. Okay. Now we are moving on to the enzyme section. Enzyme along with coenzyme is called as, yes, it's a holoenzyme. So holoenzyme means functional unit of the enzyme. Holoenzyme is you have an apoenzyme, which is a protein part, and a non-protein part called as a coenzyme. Okay. Whenever an inorganic ion acts as the non-protein part, then they are called as that non-protein part is an inorganic ion, then they are called as cofactors. Yes, very good. So such tables I have given in the synopsis. Please go through it. Very important. It is not a characteristic of allostric enzyme. Allostric enzyme means they have a different mechanism by which the enzyme activity works. They have allostric sites to act, and they does not follow Michaelis-Menten kinetics. Usually all the enzymatic reactions in our body occur following the Michaelis-Menten kinetics. Okay, whereas here in the allostric enzymes, they are multi-enzyme complexes, and instead of Michaelis-Menten kinetics, they follow sigmoid kinetics. So they give a sigmoid shaped curve rather than a rectangular hyperbola, which is actually the Michaelis-Menten curve is a rectangular hyperbola. Instead of that, allostric enzymes usually they give a sigmoid shaped curve. So they follow sigmoid kinetics rather than Michaelis-Menten kinetics. So here the answer is option B. That is, they follow Michaelis-Menten kinetics is a wrong one. So they have allostric sites that other than the active site. Okay, that is why they cannot follow Michaelis-Menten kinetics. So Michaelis-Menten concept, as I've already told you, the hypothesis just means that the enzyme should combine with the substrate to form a complex. Only then the enzymatic reaction will occur. That is the basis of a Michaelis-Menten hypothesis. So there is something called as Michaelis-Menten constant, that is Km. So which means it's a substrate concentration to produce a half maximum velocity. That means if the velocity Km value is low, that means the enzyme and substrate are having a very high affinity. That is, even a very minor concentration of the substrate itself is able to produce a very high velocity reaction. Okay, that is what is Michaelis-Menten hypothesis about. So the shape is when you plot the reaction rate, that is the velocity of the reaction against the substrate concentration Km, we get a curve, that is this curve or this graph, which is actually considered to be a rectangular hyperbola graph. That is a Michaelis-Menten curve. Okay. Now, the enzyme action model, which is represented in the diagram. So we have three enzyme action models. One is lock and key model, where the enzyme and the substrate, so the space in the enzyme where, or the active site in the enzyme where the substrate comes and binds, the shape of that active site in the enzyme as well as the substrate, the shape of the substrate is almost quite structurally similar. So they fits like a lock and key, and that is called as lock and key model. Whereas in induced fit, that they're not structurally similar, but whenever the substrate nears the enzyme, it induces a change in the active site of the enzyme. The shape of the active site of the enzyme, it just alters itself to accommodate the substrate, and then the reaction occurs. Whereas in substrate strain theory, whenever it is actually an extension of the induced fit model, so whenever that induces a fit, whenever the substrate induces a fit into the enzyme, Actually, that creates some strain. The enzyme, when it configures in its shape or alters in its shape, it induces some strain on the substrate. That is what ultimately leads to the release of products from the complex. So that is actually substrate strain theory is an extension of induced fit model. Okay, so here the picture depicts a lock and key model. Okay. Now we have come to enzyme inhibition. Competitive enzyme inhibition will cause what? Competitive inhibitor means they are competing with the substrate for the active site of the enzyme. So the competitive inhibitor usually will be structurally similar to the substrate. Okay, that is why they are competing for the active site of the enzyme. So when you increase the concentration of the substrate, we can overcome competitive enzyme inhibition. So that means increasing concentration of the substrate means there is increase of Km. We can overcome the inhibition and hence the velocity of the reaction does not get altered. So here in competitive enzyme inhibition, increase of Km with an unchanged Vmax is what usually occurs. Okay, that is this. Competitive inhibition is the first one, as I have already told you. In non-competitive inhibition, what is happening? There is no structural similarity between the substrate and the inhibitor. Actually, the inhibitor binds to a site other than the substrate binding site. Okay, so because of that, actually it is altering the enzyme, shape of the enzyme, or it is preventing the enzyme from forming a enzyme substrate complex. So in this, there is no point in increasing the substrate concentration. So there is no change in the Km, but what is happening? Vmax is getting reduced because due to the inhibition, the velocity of the reaction is not happening in the normal way. Okay, that is about non-competitive inhibition. There is something called as uncompetitive inhibition. So in uncompetitive inhibition, the uncompetitive inhibitor binds only when substrate and enzyme complex is formed. That is, enzyme and the substrate complex is already formed. Then only the inhibitor site acts, or the inhibitor site is opened up only when the enzyme forms a complex with the substrate in case of uncompetitive inhibition. So that is where the uncompetitive inhibitor is binding. So already the substrate is getting used up. That means Km is already reduced. But is a reaction happening? No. So because of that, Vmax also is reduced. So both Km and Vmax are reduced in uncompetitive inhibition. So that is about the various types of inhibition and how they alter the Km as well as the Vmax. Okay, so that is it. In competitive, Km is increased so that we can overcome the inhibition. Vmax remains unchanged. In non-competitive inhibition, Km, there's no point in altering Km, okay, but Vmax is getting reduced because due to inhibition, Vmax is getting reduced. In uncompetitive, both Km and Vmax are reduced. That is the explanation for the inhibition. Okay. Now, a classic uncompetitive inhibitor is a compound that binds. So it is uncompetitive inhibitor. Can you tell me which is the answer? So this both competitive, non-competitive, and uncompetitive inhibition. These are all types of reversible inhibition. Okay. So the ways in which non-competitive and uncompetitive inhibition can be overcome is very quite complicated, which is not necessary for you as of now. From that itself, we can just corner down that to A and C. So uncompetitive inhibitor binds reversibly, but it binds reversibly to the enzyme substrate complex, yielding an inactive enzyme substrate inhibitor complex. Okay, so the answer is option A. So we can rule out this irreversible terms. Option B and D can be ruled out because they have given irreversibly. No, actually, uncompetitive inhibition is also a reversible type of inhibition. So here, the enzyme substrate complex is first formed. Then only the inhibitor comes and binds, and hence enzyme substrate inhibitor complex is formed at the end, which actually is inactive because the reaction is not happening. In which type of inhibition, inhibitor only binds to the enzyme substrate complex? Again, it is a very easy answer. Yes, uncompetitive inhibition. Now, the final question of the session. DNA polymerase synthesizes. So, where does this DNA polymerase enzyme act, or which is that reaction that is occurring or cycle that is occurring? Is it protein synthesis? No, right? It is not protein synthesis. That was RNA polymerase in transcription, right? So where is DNA polymerase coming? Yes, DNA replication. Very good. So as I told you, always the parent strand is 3' 5' strand, and hence the DNA, when polymerase synthesizes the DNA, actually it is actually occurring in the 5', 3' direction. So DNA synthesis is occurring in the 5', 3' direction. That is the direction of synthesis of DNA. There also the mRNA was produced in the 5', 3' direction, because the parent strand is always the 3', 5' strand. So whenever DNA replication comes, we have two things. That is, we say they must leading and lagging strand. So the steps in DNA replication, I'll go through that briefly. Okay, the first step is, the DNA is a double helix, right? So first thing is the helicase enzyme comes and acts, and it unwinds the DNA double helix, opens up the helix. Okay, so that the nucleotide bases are all exposed. Okay, so that is done by the enzyme helicase. So whenever it opens up, creating the replication fork, some supercoiling can occur. The tension is avoided by the enzyme topoisomerase. That helps to, avoid the tension and the supercoiling. Whenever we are forcefully unwinding the DNA, it can tend to recoil or supercoil. That is avoided or overcome by topoisomerase enzyme. So the replication fork is created by opening up the helix by the helicase enzyme. Once that is formed, the next step is the DNA primase enzyme coming and getting attached. So the 3', 5' strand is considered to be the leading strand, while the 5', 3' strand of the parent DNA is considered to be the lagging strand. Because the direction of synthesis is always 5', 3' direction is where the synthesis should occur. So that is why the 3', the complementary one, that is the 3', 5' is the leading strand, because the synthesis we need it in the 5', 3' direction. Okay, that is in the direction of the replication fork. Fine. So the 3', 5' strand is a 3', 5' strand is a leading strand. Okay, so that's after the helicase opens up, creating the replication fork. The next step is the DNA primase coming and attaching onto the strands, both the strands. In leading strand, only one DNA primase comes and attaches, whereas in lagging strand, a multiple DNA primase comes and attaches here and there. So that the role of this DNA primase enzyme is to add some RNA primers here and there. So in the leading strand, the DNA primase adds only one RNA primer, whereas in the lagging strand, multiple RNA primers are added here and there by the DNA primase enzyme. Okay, so that is the second step. Third step is like, the nucleotide base with the complementary bases are getting added, causing the elongation of the fragment or elongation of the strand. Okay, so whenever a stop codon is, wherever we find a stop codon or something, it will come back, or the synthesis or the replication comes to a halt. Okay, so in the leading strand, actually a continuous DNA strand is created. Complementary DNA strand is created, whereas in lagging strand, since multiple RNA primers were added, they were produced as fragments. So those are called as Okazaki fragments. Now, by the ligase enzyme, these Okazaki fragments are joined together to form a complete strand. So actually, once one DNA double helix, after replication, we get two sets of DNA double helix. That's an end product. That is what is DNA replication. Okay. So is it clear? Which are all the enzymes that act? One is helicase, then topoisomerase, that is in the opening of the replication fork and preventing supercoiling. Then DNA primase acts to add the RNA primers. Okay, then the elongation is happening by the DNA polymerase enzyme. That is what acts in the elongation process. Okay, so it is DNA polymerase 1. And then ultimately the Okazaki fragments are joined together by the ligase enzyme. Okay, so is that clear? That is about DNA replication. So we have come to the end of the session. Any doubts? Okay, I think all of you can go through the videos. Okay, and any doubts after going through the videos, you can just get back to me. Okay, you can message me with any doubts if you have with any of the pathways or any of the questions. Fine. Now, as of now, I'm just winding up the session. Again, I wish all of you a wonderful, happy and prosperous new year, that all your dreams come true, that you all come out of the exam with flying colors. Okay, wish you all the best. Now we'll meet again for the oral medicine and radiology session. Fine. Thank you all.